Hi, folks. Here's my old background. The old wall of books trick. I am in our combination dining room study. And Dolores says, hi all. Carmen says, hi here. And queer, laugh out loud, just kidding. Dolores says, hello everyone. Lana says, howdy. Steve Gonzo says, there's no business like Joe business. Hashtag the Joe must go on. Carmen says, great background. Well, it's the old academic background. Kay says, thank you, Dolores, as I got no notice on my Facebook page. What is going on with Facebook these days? I mean, the promo was shared out there like an hour ago. Kay says, hi, everybody. Glad to see you. I'm glad to see you all, too. Thank you for coming. So, lots of things to share today and to talk about. We'll start with something, I think it's from Ryan Cooper at The Week. This was on June 7th. This one's about unemployment. Democrats are giving up their greatest achievement since the 1960s. The pandemic boost unemployment benefits has helped millions of Americans. There's Joe Biden throwing up his hands. The $600 boost unemployment and benefits passed in the CARES Act last year was the best policy passed in this country since the 1960s. Sadly, that measure expired long ago, but the American Rescue Plan passed by Democrats in March included a $300 supplement that is still pretty great, together with some other boosts to the program. But now, 25 Republican-controlled states and counting have bailed on the $300 boost. Sorry, did I say 26? 25 Republican-controlled states and counting have bailed on the $300 boost. And President Biden isn't fighting them. On the contrary, Press Secretary Jen Psaki said states have every right to reject the money, which is not actually true, as I'll explain below. Biden himself now said it's good the program will officially expire in September. This retreat from an accomplishment that helped keep millions of Americans out of destitution is a disgrace. It's worth remembering how the original super unemployment program came about in March and April. The pandemic was wrecking the economy. States and cities were locking down. People feared to go out and spend money, and jobs were vanishing en masse. New unemployment claims spiked up to 6.1 million in a single week. That compares to, I believe it was 700,000 a month in the Great Recession, 2008. The U.S. unemployment system was not remotely designed to deal, it must have been 700,000 a week then, but still, 700,000 versus 6.1 million. The U.S. unemployment system was not remotely designed to deal with a shattering emergency like this. In most states, unemployment is supposed to be a bare subsistence payment to tide you over between jobs. It's annoying and time-consuming to claim. Wrongful denials are common, and often you have to endure a lot of abusive hectoring that assumes you are a sponging moocher, if not a criminal. In the worst states like Florida, there practically is no unemployment system at all. It's been designed not to work so as to further coerce the unemployed to take any job they can find and to keep down state spending and thus taxes on the rich. So when tens of millions of people were thrown out of work practically overnight, Democrats scrambled to make the unemployment system more like a European version that you could actually live on. The natural idea was to change the benefit formula so that it paid out 100% of your previous earnings. Unfortunately, state unemployment bureaucracies are so ancient and crummy that such a calculation could not be made without months and months of retooling. Instead, congressional Democrats just tacked on an additional $600 per week so that the average benefit would equal the average wage. This turned out to be a terrific help for people who were previously making less than average. For instance, if you were making $200 a week and got laid off in April 2020 and managed to claim your benefits, suddenly your income was more than tripled. Reporters wrote dozens of stories about how people who had been living hand to mouth for years suddenly had an economic cushion. People paid off credit card debt, got their cars or homes fixed, set some money away for retirement, or simply just bought themselves something nice. Okay, a little economic security can be revolutionary for people who have never had it. As noted above, the $600 supplement expired in July last year. It was renewed at $300 in September, which was then extended as part of Biden's American Rescue Plan. Two other programs were also concluded in the ARP, an extension of the duration of unemployment benefits, plus an expansion of benefit eligibility to many more classes of workers, called Pandemic Unemployment Insurance, or PUA. There is every reason to keep all these boosts going through September at least, which is when they're scheduled to expire, if not longer. For one thing, the pandemic is still not even close to over, while a number of states seem to have reached herd immunity. That is not remotely true of many more conservative states, which seems to be stuck at less than half of adults vaccinated. Unless they can get those numbers up, future regional coronavirus outbreaks could keep happening for months or years. Second, it's the right thing to do, both morally and economically. The American working class has taken it on the chin for the last 40 years, sold out by both political parties that cut welfare benefits, killed unions, and stood by while corporations shipped jobs overseas and inequality skyrocketed. A little extra money in the pockets of a fairly small proportion of the population won't cause any kind of crisis. Indeed, it would help the economy to keep some stimulus going so that high demand can be sustained long enough to sort out various supply bottlenecks. The U.S. is still about 7.5 million jobs in the hole compared to before the pandemic. Since the U3 was 6.6 before the pandemic, but before the pandemic, we're looking at 14.1 million jobs is the U3 statistic. Should be the U3 statistics right now. Even in the best case scenario, it will take many months for that many jobs to come online. And in the meantime, boosted unemployment will be a vital source of income. Third, preserving the PUA portion of the unemployment boost is legally required. As Matt Brunig explains at the People's Policy Project, the law stipulates that while states can opt out of the $300 supplement, the Department of Labor must extend PUA benefits. The department's own Inspector General issued an opinion last year making this explicit. Quote, "The relevant language is not discretionary," unquote, it said. I see two reasons Democrats are unwilling to defend their own biggest achievement in decades. First is that the party basically can't do anything unless there is a crisis. The American constitutional structure is a janky mess, and the party is deeply split both ideologically and along class lines. A really bold policy like super unemployment could only happen as a response to catastrophe. Now that the most serious part of the crisis is over, the urgency is lost, and their traditional, timid hesitancy is coming back. Second, Democrats basically agree with conservatives about the need to discipline and starve the working class. The reason Republican governors unemployment benefits is, as Karl Marx explained, they want to beat workers into laboring for capitalists at whatever wages are on offer. A few small business tyrants found themselves in the unaccustomed position of not having a big queue of desperate unemployed people available to work for minimum wage. So they ran crying to the government to demand it create more desperation, and Republican governors are obliging. I guess one thing I have to say is it serves people right for voting for Republican governors. I would never do that. Biden is singing the same tune. After half-heartedly defending the $300 boost for a few months last week, he said, quote, "It makes sense," unquote, that the program, quote, expires in 90 days, unquote. In reality, there's actually little sign that the unemployment boost is holding back labor supply, recent reports have shown. Most people moving out of the labor force altogether or quitting jobs voluntarily, making them ineligible for unemployment. And most states have requirements about not turning down suitable jobs. But because the Democrats have no solid rooting in the working class, a few complaints from rich businessmen or discredited economists with a decades-long record of failure. And that's a link to the Washington Post article on the Biden-Summers call on the economy. With a decades-long record of failure is all it takes to get the party elite running scared from their own best policies. It does not bode well for the rapidly passing remainder of this congressional term. I think Ryan hit it on the head with that one, don't you? I mean, man, this business, he should be trumpeting from the rooftops that he passed that extra 300. And by the way, in the next reconciliation bill, he should have a further extension of the extra 300 passed in that bill. People still need it. They don't get it unless they're unemployed, right? Anyway, next we have a piece on inflation by the estimable Jamie Galbraith. For my money, one of the best economists currently living. Title of this piece is "The Deeper Anxieties of the Inflation Hawks." And it was written for Project Syndicate, Peer-to Project Syndicate. And it's called "The Deeper Anxieties of the Inflation Hawks." Did I say that already? On June 3rd, 2021, by James K. Galbraith. Following an increase in consumer prices during the first quarter of the year, commentators who are already wringing their hands about inflation have now doubled down on their position. But the economic arguments used to justify such fears simply do not stand up to scrutiny. He wrote this in Austin, Texas, where he teaches at the University of Texas. In a recent commentary for the Washington Post, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Lawrence H. Summers stated that the Consumer Price Index rose at a 7.5% annual rate in the first quarter of 2021. Jamie says, I could not reproduce this number from the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPU website, which reports a year-on-year increase, April 2020 to April 2021, of 4.2%, driven largely by a sharp 49.6% rebound in gasoline prices from their pandemic crash. When food and energy prices are excluded, the inflation rate over the past year comes to just 3%. Odder still is Summers' rationale for projecting future inflationary risks. Quote, inflationary pressures, this is a quote from Summers, are mounting from the boost in demand created by the $2 trillion plus in savings that Americans have accumulated during the pandemic. From large-scale Federal Reserve debt purchases, along with Fed forecasts of essentially zero interest rates into 2024, from roughly $3 trillion in fiscal stimulus passed by Congress, and from soaring stock and real estate prices, unquote. This is odd logic, beginning with the conjecture that savings cause inflation. John Maynard Keynes argued the reverse. Excess savings are withheld from demand, causing unemployment. In Summers' own neoclass, in other words, savings are deflationary. In Summers' own neoclassical school normally holds that high savings are a good thing because they sustain low interest rates and lead to more business investment. So far as I know, no economist has ever before suggested that savings as such cause inflation. Boy, Larry Summers is getting old. Likewise, while it's true that when the Fed buys up unwanted private debts, mostly from banks, the sellers get cash, shielding them from losses they might otherwise have suffered. This protection has no direct connection to their lending habits. As the economist Hyman Minsky pointed out, banks make loans when they have credit-worthy customers. They neither lend their reserves, nor do they need reserves in order to lend. What you just heard, folks, is a little bit of MMT gospel based on Hyman Minsky's work. Next is the claim that the Fed's forecasts of future low interest rates are inflationary. Actually, the Fed's interest rate forecast is contingent on its inflation forecast. And its current position is that it expects price pressures to be transitory and will react by raising rates if that turns out to be wrong. If the Fed agreed with Summers about future inflation, it would have said so in its inflation forecast. The interest rate forecast has no independent role, says Galbraith. Summers then points to $3 trillion of fiscal stimulus already enacted, but some $2 trillion of this is stored in private savings for now. So this point is redundant with the first one. Finally, he mentions, quote, soaring stock and real estate prices. Yet we heard no such warnings from him in the late 1990s when he was Treasury Secretary during a massive stock boom, and rightly so. The boom did not cause an increase in inflation. What is really at work here? Summers may simply be attempting to revive the old Phillips curve concept, which states that as unemployment falls, wages and therefore prices rise. But if this pattern ever existed, it disappeared 50 years ago, and even the slowest thinking economists largely abandoned the Phillips curve by the mid-1990s. Maybe Larry Summers has become an even slower thinking economist than those. Since then, almost all new U.S. jobs have been created in the services sector, where, quote, tight, unquote, labor markets have little effect on wages and none on consumer prices. Moreover, today's U.S. labor markets aren't even close to tight. The ratio of employment to population is still at least 4 percentage points below where it was a year ago, and it seems to be flattening after a sharp rebound. That means there are still about 5 million people who were working in 2019 but are not working today. This is in contrast to Ryan Cooper, who says there are 7.5 million people who are working pre-pandemic who still are not working today. The reasons are unknown. Perhaps employers haven't wanted them back, or the jobs on offer aren't very good. Maybe they will return later this year or beyond, when the buffer provided by all those savings runs low. What then is driving Summers's inflation fear? When an economist of his stature makes such specious claims, one can only wonder if there isn't something else on his mind. To be sure, there are some actual price risks. A big one is financial speculation in oil, metals, timber, for home construction, and so forth. It is not uncommon for financial players to bid up prices by taking these goods off the market early in a boom. The Chinese know this and are duly cracking down on the hoarding of copper and other materials. Another risk would emerge if the Fed took the advice of inflation hawks. For most businesses, interest is a cost like any other, and an increase in that cost would be passed through in part to consumer prices. It is interesting that Summers doesn't mention either of these, which could be mitigated with tough financial sector regulation and, of course, by not raising interest rates. But deeper worries may be lurking beneath the surface of Summers's essay. One concerns that $2 trillion in savings through direct payments and expanded unemployment insurance, a fair amount of that sum went to working class households. The first big chunk of change for many such families in decades. Having some cash could make them less likely to borrow and thus less dependent on banks. Workers might even hold out for higher wages, creating the labor shortage of which Summers speaks, at least temporarily. More generally, when people have a bit of financial cushion, they're harder to boss around. A second source of anxiety may be spotted in Summers's call for, quote, clear statements that the United States desires a strong dollar, unquote. This is the secret angst of the hard money men, an insecure lot who fret that their position on the global totem pole might not be entirely secure. Perhaps they are right. Today's dollar-centered world reflects the power alignments of the period between the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War in 1989. By U.S. power has since eroded, opening the possibility that the world's monetary system could one day flip. That may not happen anytime soon, but if and when the moment comes, it will follow from decades of decline, from better strategies pursued elsewhere, he might have said, such as in China, from the self-inflicted wounds of the Reagan, Clinton, and Bush eras. I might have added the Obama era and the Trump era, from the sacrifice of America's industrial base in the 1980s, from the fragility of the global order that emerged in the 1990s, and from the military overreach in the 2000s. Against all that, a few, quote, clear statements, unquote, won't mean much. In other words, two articles now saying, stop worrying about inflation. There ain't much to worry about. And I've told past, the evidence does not suggest that we have to worry about serious inflation anytime soon. So let's move on to, what shall we call him? Shall we call him Dishonorable Joe? Or should we call him Despicable Joe. Is that where we're moving on to? No, I'm sorry. We are not quite there yet. We're still one more on inflation before we move on to the dishonorable, despicable one. We have another piece here, Let the Post-Pandemic Boom Ride. This is from the week also. And again from Ryan Cooper. Most of the articles that I show from the week come from Ryan Cooper. Because to me, he makes the most sense of anybody over there. But anyway, okay, America's economic recovery from the pandemic has been halting. But there are signs that it may be starting to really take off. The latest figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics show the number of job openings is skyrocketing, as well as the number of people quitting. Conservatives and rich people are starting to panic over the situation. The idea of workers having the ability to be choosy about job opportunities, or even worse, successfully demanding higher wages, is horrifying to them. So they are already building a pressure campaign to bully the Federal Reserve into strangling the economy before the damage from the pandemic has been fixed. Deutsche Bank recently warned inflation is a global time bomb, quote unquote. CNC reports, and quote again, as many as 65% of millionaires are concerned about inflation caused by recent government spending. America is, quote, on the verge of an inflation crisis, wrote Senator Ted Cruz in a recent op-ed. These people will really say anything. They'll just say anything. It doesn't have to be based in fact. They're worried about workers having too much power, so they start screwing around. This fear-mongering is wildly exaggerated and must be resisted. Oh, there's one other point I want to add here, which is very important. Since the austerity justifications are now much weaker than they have been in the past, they're still there and they're still used. But since government spending in fairly large amounts has already occurred, and there are the arguments out there now against austerity based on MNT. They know that the best way to try to get the spending stopped is to talk about inflation problems. In the old days, like in the 1960s and the early 1970s, it was usually jobs versus inflation. That's what the big debate was. Usually, jobs eventually won. People wanted jobs more than they wanted low inflation. That's probably going to happen again. People need those jobs. If they have jobs, they can usually ride out a mild inflation of some sort. So people care more about jobs than they do about clamping down on the economy and causing a recession. Let's dig into the data from the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS, for last month, which is genuinely surprising. Since the pandemic started to ease off in the U.S. around March, there have not been that many jobs created. America is still about 7.6 million jobs down from where it was in February 2020. So you see, Jamie was talking about 5 million from 2019. Ryan has a different time frame involved. He's comparing, he's saying we're 7.6 million jobs down from where we were in February 2020 when Trump was shouting and screaming about what a great economy we have and how low the unemployment rate is. I think you recall that. But at that time, there was still, as I said, 6.6 million people employed. Ryan is saying we're 7.6 million jobs down from where we were then. So as I told you, it's 14.1, 14.2 million jobs should be the U3 figure right now. I don't know what it actually shows. I haven't looked at it this week. However, monthly job openings have skyrocketed from about 7.5 million in March, about how many there were in late 2018, up to 9.2 million in May, the highest level measured since this survey began in 2000. The share of workers quitting their jobs each month has also surged to 2.7%, also the highest figure since 2000. The rate of quits in the accommodation and restaurant industry is 5.6%, again a record, as is always worth mentioning. All these various reports are noisy and preliminary. It will take many months before we can be sure what exactly is happening. However, it's possible to make some educated guesses. On the one hand, the pandemic created a lot of disruptions in business and the labor market. The global system of production was in ragged shape even in 2019, thanks to a decade of weak demand, and the pandemic inflicted a lot more damage. Meanwhile, it seems a large number of people are rethinking their careers. Many already precarious categories of workers have had an absolutely brutal year. A recent study found that line cooks had the highest COVID-19 mortality risk out of any profession, including healthcare workers. Warehouse work, agriculture, baking, and construction rounded out the top 5 highest virus risk professions. These and many other jobs typically had low wages and meager benefits even before they became so deadly. It seems many folks in those professions are looking to find something better, perhaps having seen how nice it is to have some economic security thanks to the various benefits in the pandemic rescue packages. Others seem to be quitting the labor force entirely to spend more time with their families. On the other hand, the American consumer is unusually flush with cash. The lockdowns and pandemic relief bills meant that both of the population saved tons of money over the last year, something like $2.4 trillion. We are seeing enormous demand for housing, cars, computer chips, and hundreds of other products. Strong demand runs into constrained supply, and that's how we have supply bottlenecks and price increases in all sorts of places. Lumber, semiconductors, container shipping, and so on. It's not hard to imagine how this might work out reasonably well. Businesses will get more and more desperate for labor so they can build out supply capacity to deal with the bottlenecks. They will be forced to hike their wage offers and improve workplace conditions to get workers, because just about any job can be made good with enough pay, benefits, and labor control over the workplace. Workers will flow into high productivity businesses that can afford to pay well. The abusive, non-innovative businesses that only got by over the last decade by exploiting labor, like practically all the gig companies, will either improve or go out of business. In a year or two, we'll be back to a very low unemployment economy, but this time with substantially higher wages and productivity and a much more robust supply side. But all that can only happen if demand remains strong, despite the fact that in some markets like lumber and housing, recent price spikes have already turned around, suggesting these supply bottlenecks will be temporary. We are still seeing a big panic about inflation. The push is aimed at the Federal Reserve to convince Chairman Jerome Powell to hike interest rates and crush the boom before the stronger economy can emerge. There are 2 reasons. First, conservatives want to strangle the economy so that Joe Biden will be blamed for lack of jobs. Second, rich people want to keep the economy weak to maintain their vast power and wealth. A recent ProPublica report examined the taxes of some of the richest people in the world and found them paying almost nothing on their staggering hoards. Between 2014 and 2018, Michael Bloomberg gained $22.5 billion in wealth, but paid just 1.3% of that in taxes. In other words, that was increased income that went to wealth, became wealth, but pay just 1.3% of that in taxes. Jeff Bezos paid just 0.98% of his less than 1% of his 99 billion wealth gain in tax. And Warren Buffett paid just 0.1% on his wealth gain of 24.3 billion in tax. The big reason these men are worth so much is the desperate condition of the American working class. If workers were scarce, business would have to pay higher wages to attract them, leaving less of the corporate surplus for shareholders and top executives, and hence causing less appreciation in financial assets. If labor markets get tight enough, we might see unions start to spread. So to keep the ultra-rich in ultra-large yachts, the American workers must remain desperate. But unless you have enough money to buy your own smallish continent, don't listen to this nonsense about inflation. You'd be much better off letting this boom ride and seeing where it takes us. Yes, indeed. So now on to despicable, dishonorable Joe. There he is. Biden's bipartisanship, quote unquote, has let Manchin take the infrastructure bill hostage. Let me share that for you before I go any further. As I recall, this one is by William Rivers Pitt, June 9th, 2021, yesterday. The time-eating puppet show playing out between President Biden and Senate Republicans over the infrastructure bill has concluded its first phase. Each side played their roles well, if you're into that sort of thing. Shelley Moore Capito, the West Virginia lawmaker leading the Senate GOP group in the negotiations, continued to hand Biden bag after bag of unworkable GOP ideas, quote unquote, while Biden held tight to the mantle of bipartisan guy-in-chief, even as he swatted down Capito's nonsense suggestions one by one. As impossible as it may sound, the next phase of this process promises to be even more maddening. Quote, the breakdown did not close off the possibility of a bipartisan compromise entirely, reports the Times. And quote again, and the White House signaled the president would continue seeking one. He shifted his focus to a bipartisan group of centrist senators who've been working separately on an alternative, calling three of them personally to cheer on their efforts and encourage them to work with top White House officials to hammer out a deal, unquote. The, quote, bipartisan group currently includes 6 senators, among them Republicans Mitt Romney and Rob Portman. On the Democratic side sit, wait for it, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, 2 of the people who are currently the reason why we can't have nice things like roads, bridges, and voting. Somehow, we're expected to believe these 2, with the help of Mitt, the human weatherman, and Portman, a stalwart ally of Mitch McConnell's obstructionism for the last decade, are capable or even interested in pulling this rabbit out of a hat. A growing number of Democrats, both within and without the progressive caucuses in the House and Senate, have had about a belly full of this elongated mess, or so they say anyway. CNN White House reporter Manu Raju and Lauren Fox spoke to multiple Democratic senators after a closed-door lunch on Tuesday, after Sinema announced her confidence that a deal could be struck before departing the meeting. Several senators threw buckets of cold water on the idea that the Republicans were interested in doing anything other than running out the clock to the August recess. Confidence in Manchin and Sinema specifically was not high. There is no way Manchin and Sinema are going to cut a deal that represents the view of the caucus, quote unquote, said one Democratic senator who was not named in the CNN report. Quote, a group of 4 or 5 people don't get to carry 50 Democratic votes on their back, unquote, said a second, also unnamed senator. Quote, I've been ready to move on from bipartisanship for major priorities for the Biden administration for a while now, unquote, said Senator Mazie Hirono, voicing the opinion of many in the room. Okay, and Mazie Hirono is not exactly the most boisterous of the people in the Congressional Progressive Caucus. At this point, I'm not even sure if she's a member. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of ongoing Republican obstruction against popular Democratic legislation. The Paycheck Fairness Bill, a bill aimed at addressing the gender wage gap, was successfully filibustered to death by Republicans on Tuesday. Not one of them voted for it. I think that's bipartisanship. This is a quote, coming to a screeching halt this month because the majority leader is starting with the so-called Paycheck Fairness Bill late this afternoon, unquote, said Mitch yesterday, quote again, which is essentially a giveaway to the plaintiffs' lawyers in America, a series of totally partisan bills designed to get no Republican support, unquote. There it is, right there in flaming letters, 10 stories tall. This has been Mitch's playbook since 2009. He makes promising noises before undercutting the Democratic bills, and then grandstands about how it's the other side's fault. The minority leader is the political version of a funnel spider. He leads his prey to the edge of his lair and then bursts out of his hole to inject his poison before dragging his victim down into the dark so his children can feed. McConnell pulled this exact same number on Joe Manchin just the other day. Manchin, who is resisting the Voting Reform for the People Act, has voiced support for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. This was Manchin going out on a limb for the sake of his beloved bipartisanship, but McConnell chopped him down and made him look like a fool. Why? Because for as long as McConnell is minority leader, there will be no legislation passed that aids President Biden politically if he can possibly help it. This includes an infrastructure bill, the filibuster, the voting bill, and whatever else might be on the White House menu. Dude may as well be holding a sign, yet Manchin and his cohort blunder on toward the funnel hole like a clutch of juicy beetles that have lost their way. That's a great simile there. The infrastructure bill can't be passed in the Senate via reconciliation without a single Republican vote. That appears to be the only way it will happen. All 50 Democratic senators, along with Vice President Kamala Harris, will have to vote in favor. So lashing Manchin and his people to the mast is the paramount priority. So long as this dithering caucus of Mitt, Rob, Joe, and Kirsten, along with the president, belabor the fiction of possible bipartisanship. However, Manchin and company will threaten to break ranks when voting time comes. In every meaningful sense, what we have here is a hostage crisis with Manchin as the lead hostage taker. All these pieces of vital legislation and the people they would serve are the hostages. In this, Biden is squarely complicit with his drawn-out request for something that has a snowball's chance in hell of happening while McConnell sits in the minority leader's chair. Only a hard turn toward the reconciliation process and a reckoning with Manchin and his crew have any real chance of resolving the infrastructure impasse. It will likely be days before we see any sort of resolution, Biden has winged his way to Europe for the next 8 days to try and repair the appalling damage done by the previous administration. For the time being, expect a lot of talk and no action. Um, 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 and no action. Alas, puppet shows aren't only for children anymore. We no longer call them puppet shows. We now call them kabuki theater. Kabuki theater is the term of art since 2009. William Rivers Pitt. And now we come to more Manchin related material. This one from Common Dreams. We are coming, Poor People's Campaign, to march against Manchin obstructionism in West Virginia. This is by Brett Wilkins, staff writer, June 8, 2021. Outraged by Joe Manchin's obstruction of Democratic efforts to protect and expand voting rights and end the Senate filibuster, the faith-led Poor People's Campaign has announced it will lead a Moral Monday demonstration in the West Virginia senator's home state next week. Quote, it's time to march on his office, the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, the second co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, said of Manchin, the Senate's most conservative Democrat, in an interview with Religion News Service. Quote, it's time for people of all differences to stand together against him. We call it, quote, from the hollers in the mountains to the hood, unquote. And Reverend Barber tweets, the hashtag Poor People's Campaign is announcing today that on Monday the 14th, we will hold a moral march on Manchin in West Virginia, led by West Virginians of all colors, creeds, etc., from the hood to the hollers. And replying to himself, Manchin's policies hurt poor and low-wealth people, and he's against $15 an hour living wages and expanding voting rights. He's supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and has abandoned the poor and low-wealth people of his own state and the nation, and they're tired of it. Manchin's positions are wrong, constitutionally inconsistent, historically inaccurate, morally indefensible, economically insane, and politically unacceptable. Thank you, Reverend Barber. Quote, thousands upon thousands of people don't agree with Manchin's economic position or his position on voting rights or his position on the filibuster, and it's time for them to speak up, unquote, Barber added. Pam Garrison, a co-chair of the West Virginia Poor People's Campaign, said she has watched Manchin, quote, talk about compromise, and I wonder, what reality is he in? Is he that delusional? Or does he think we're that stupid, unquote? Quote, we are coming, and I'll tell you what my fellow Americans are coming with me, unquote, said Garrison of next Monday's march. Quote, we're in this together, and we're not taking no for an answer. We can do better. We deserve better. And the Reverend Barber tweeted back, Pam Garrison at the West Virginia PPC, Poor People's Campaign, says, at Senator Joe Manchin, what reality is he in? We're coming, and I'll tell you what, my fellow Americans are coming with me. We're marching on Manchin in West Virginia next, hashtag Moral Monday, June 14th. Join us, thirdreconstruction.org, and there's a little video there. Manchin's purported pursuit of bipartisan solutions, efforts opponents argue will bear little fruit, with Republican colleagues led by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, the self-proclaimed, quote, Grim Reaper, unquote, has rankled progressives. He is the sole Senate Democrat to refuse to co-sponsor the For the People Act, a landmark bill to expand and protect voting rights, supported by 79% of likely West Virginia voters. Manchin also stands staunchly opposed to ending the filibuster, a weapon that has historically been used to torpedo civil and voting rights legislation. And there's a tweet from Robert Greenwald. Is there anything dumber than seeking bipartisan support for voting rights by legislation with the people who are trying to take away voting rights? Some observers also bristled at what they perceived as the incongruity and tone deafness of Manchin singing the civil rights anthem, quote, "We shall overcome," unquote, during a Joan Baez tribute at the Kennedy Center Honors Sunday night. The very same day, the senator published an op-ed in the Charleston Gazette-Mail explaining why he will vote against the For the People Act. In response, Mondaire Jones, Democrat of New York, tweeted that the piece, quote, might as well be titled, quote, "While I'll Vote to Preserve Jim Crow." And the Reverend Barber tweeted, "Please tell me Manchin wasn't singing, quote, 'We shall overcome' the same day he published an op-ed about why he won't vote to defend the voting rights civil rights leaders fought and died for. This is why West Virginians are holding hashtag Moral Monday March on Manchin's office next Monday, 6/14. On Tuesday, Manchin held what he called a, quote, "productive," unquote, meeting with civil rights leaders, while the black leaders, who included NAAC President and CEO Derek Johnson, National Urban League President Mark Morial, and the Reverend Al Sharpton, stressed the importance of passing legislation to strengthen voting rights. Joe Manchin left the meeting unmoved in his opposition to the For the People Act. Quote, "I don't think anybody changed positions on that," he told The Hill. While Johnson hailed the meeting as, quote, "robust and insightful," and, quote, "focused on finding common ground," unquote. But Jamal Bowman, Democrat of New York, wasn't nearly as cordial, calling Manchin's response to the meeting, quote, "disrespectful," unquote, and his motivations, quote, "questionable," unquote. Jamal Bowman said, he tweeted, "Joe Manchin isn't moved by leaders who have spent decades organizing for civil rights. But Manchin isn't moved by the views of his constituents. He isn't moved by the GOP voter suppression bills in 43 states, because Manchin is only moved by corporate donors and their agenda." And this was a retweet of a tweet by Lauren Fox. The content of which we've already gone over. While Manchin's chimeric quest for Senate unity has left some observers scratching their heads, others say that understanding his unrequited ardor for bipartisanship is as simple as following the money. Americans for Prosperity, a conservative political advocacy group bankrolled by billionaire Charles Koch, has been pressuring Manchin to hold steadfast in his opposition to crucial Democratic agenda reforms. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the nation's largest lobbying group, has rewarded him and Senator Kyrsten Sinema, another filibuster preservationist who has broken with her party on more votes than any other senator, except for Manchin, with thousands of dollars in campaign contributions. And progressives also worry that Manchin, who has taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions from fossil fuel interests in recent election cycles, could stymie legislative efforts to address the climate emergency. There's a tweet from the New Yorker that I won't try to go over here. Biden said he discussed issues including ending the filibuster and raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which Manchin also opposes during a meeting with the senator early this year. Quote, we explained why his defense of the filibuster was historically inaccurate and politically dangerous. Now his position against living wages was hurting over half of the workforce of West Virginia, unquote, Barber said to Religion News Service. The Reverend said he explained that Manchin's opposition to the For the People Act, quote, was hurting not just black people, but white people, brown people, and particularly poor and low wealth people, unquote. So, more movement is building. Again, William Rivers Pitt, I believe it's Pitt, June 8th, 2021. Civil rights leaders and West Virginia miners turn up the heat on Joe Manchin. As noted yesterday, West Virginia's rocking the road Senator Joe Manchin is all but untouchable at the moment, secure in his office until 2024, and with the threat of defection to the GOP ever present. He remains able to snarl vital legislation and filibuster reform abolition without the building falling down on him. Manchin's next week or two won't be the building falling, but he is about to hear from activists and religious leaders who spent their lives at the ramparts fighting the long struggle for civil rights in the U.S. In a similar vein, the cork has popped on the progressive side of the House of Representatives, with patience for Manchin's self-serving intransigence nearing a very loud end. This morning, Manchin took a meeting with the heads of the National Urban League, the National Council of Negro Women, NAACP, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The institutional memory of systemic racism within these groups is beyond profound, and the outcome of their conversation with Manchin regarding the civil rights laws he is blocking was waited for with great interest. But it appears Manchin emerged from this morning's meeting unmoved by the arguments put before him. Manchin called the conversation constructive, but he indicated he hadn't changed any minds. And the Reverend Barber said, even if Manchin doesn't change, we have to bear witness to how his policies are hurting the democracy, are a form of political and legislative violence, and that he is standing more on the side of the corporate lobbyists rather than poor and wealth workers and people across this country, unquote. This will not be Manchin's first encounter with Barber and the Poor People's Campaign after voicing his resistance to the $15 an hour minimum wage back in February. Manchin met with Barber, who came away from the meeting deeply disappointed. Quote, we're not interested in compromise, unquote. He said to reporters at the time, $15 is a compromise. What Manchin was suggesting would just further keep people in poverty, unquote. On Monday, Barber called Manchin's stances on the voting bills and the filibuster, quote, wrong, constitutionally inconsistent, historically inaccurate, morally indefensible, economically insane, and politically unacceptable. It's open to question whether Barber's planned June 15th march on Manchin will have any more effect than his February meeting did. But Barber is hardly alone in voicing his deep anger at the West Virginia Democrat. It's getting awfully loud under the Capitol dome. And there's the quote from Mondaire Jones I already gave you. In addition, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez accused Manchin of supporting voter suppression, and progressive colleague Jamal Bowman concurred. Quote, Republicans have been ramming through voter suppression bills around the country along party lines. Democrats can't afford to condition protecting the right to vote on their cooperation, unquote. It's also getting loud back in West Virginia. The United Mine Workers a muscular organization that is a power in that state, came out in favor of the voting legislation Manchin opposes. It is wrong for these states to attack the basic rights of citizens to participate in our democracy, said the UMWA International President Cecil Roberts. Quote, Congress should be doing everything possible to not just maintain, but expand voting access and create freer and fairer elections. If only one party is interested in doing that, then so be it, unquote. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has announced his intention to bring this legislation up for a vote during the week of June 24th, no matter where Manchin may be on this matter. That's 2 weeks from today, 2 weeks to see if a man who says no like a record on repeat can be made to see the light. It would probably be helpful if the President of the United States did some more lobbying of his own, too. I'm just saying, says William Rivers Pitt. And one more now, not just one more, but one of two more. Let me share this, called Manchin Family Values. Guess what this one is about? It's an expose from Counterpunch. June 10th, 2021, Manchin Family Values by Fred Gardner. Who dat? The Mylan CEO. No one is more frustrated than I am. Who dat Mylan CEO? Heather Manchin Bresch. Yes, Joe Manchin's daughter. Quote, ever since I've been in this position and when I was governor, we made a point. We just didn't get involved. It's so convoluted. I don't understand. To get into something you don't understand, and your daughter being in this type of industry, it was best I stayed away. My daughter is my daughter with unconditional love. She's the most amazing person that I know. She's so compassionate and generous in how she's always lived her life. Joe Manchin said that to Bloomberg News in September 2016. His daughter, Heather Manchin Bresch, CEO of Mylan, had raised the price of EpiPens by almost 500% since 2009, undoubtedly because she's so compassionate and generous in how she's always lived her life. EpiPens are life-saving devices for people who go into anaphylactic shock after exposure to certain substances, peanuts, the venom in a bee sting, latex, and others. The medicine in an EpiPen costs pennies. It is epinephrine, a synthesized version of adrenaline, the hormone made by our bodies. The EpiPen has a patented spring-loaded injector that makes it unnecessary to draw medicine into a syringe prior to injection. Time is of the essence when a person is going into anaphylactic shock. Purchasers are reminded that epinephrine loses potency over time, and EpiPens have to be purchased annually. The EpiPen 2-pack sold by Mylan that cost a little over $100 in 2009 and would cost a little under $500 in 2016, thanks to Joe Manchin's daughter. The EpiPen is the product of U.S. taxpayer-funded research conducted in the 1970s for the Pentagon, which wanted an auto-injector device for soldiers facing exposure to nerve gas by a company called Survival Technology. The rights to market a civilian version to prevent anaphylaxis were then sold and resold. Survival merged with Brunswick, which sold the rights to Day, the subsidiary of Merck, which in 2007 sold the rights to Mylan, which made a production deal with King, a wholly owned subsidiary of Pfizer. After some superficial improvements, a stronger spring, clear instructions that supposedly justified raising prices, Milan began its big marketing push in 2009. With almost 90% of the market, their key goal was to get every school in the United States to keep EpiPens on hand. Children face the highest risk of a fatal response because many never have been exposed to the substance that they're allergic to. Adults generally know what they're allergic to and try to avoid exposure or carry the antidote. As governor of West Virginia, Joe Manchin had appointed his wife to the State Board of Education in 2007. By 2012, Gail Connolly Manchin would be president of the National Association of State Boards of Education, an official sounding but private outfit that lobbies state boards to adopt policies favored by association members. In 2016, by USA Today, a paper that doesn't get enough credit for serious muckraking, reported that Mrs. Manchin had, quote, spearheaded an unprecedented effort that encouraged states to require schools to purchase medical devices that fight life-threatening allergic reactions. Quote again, the association's move helped pave the way for Mylan Specialty, maker of EpiPens, to develop a near monopoly in school nurses' offices. 11 states drafted laws requiring epinephrine auto injectors. Nearly every other state recommended schools stock them after what the White House called the EpiPen law, quote unquote, 2013, gave funding preference to those that did, unquote. It is reassuring to know that none of this was ever discussed when the Manchin's daughter Heather was in earshot. At Thanksgiving dinner, it was all, quote, please pass the mashed potatoes, Dad, unquote. There's a photo of an EpiPen 2-pack. With the epinephrine auto injectors, 0.3 milligrams, and they even put in a grade trainer to train people how to inject them. Heather's brilliant career was launched after Joe Manchin introduced her to the CEO of Mylan. Although a claim to have a master's degree in business administration was exposed as a lie, her fast rise to the top was unimpeded. Heather had something better than a degree. She had real audacity. And so she quadrupled the price of a drug that several million Americans must have on hand and buy every year. Somebody ought to confirm, that epinephrine degrades significantly in a year. It might be a pseudo-scientific marketing device like Dial Soap's famous rinse and repeat, quote unquote. Heather's salary rose from $2.5 million in 2007 to $18.9 million in 2015. She was then 45 years old and would have become the poster child of pharmaceutical industry greed, otherwise known as PIG, had it not been for Martin Shkreli, who raised the price of the anti-parasitic drug Diapram from $13.50 to $750. Then the publicity-welcoming pharma bro, quote unquote, won the auction for the world's only copy of a hip-hop album by Wu-Tang Clan. Shkreli was sentenced to 7 years and may still be doing time for securities fraud, but presumably he got to enjoy, quote, once upon a time in Shaolin, unquote, before the 2 CD rarity was seized by the feds. Heather is married to a corporate lawyer named Jeffrey Bresch, whose firm represents, in addition to numerous Fortune 500 companies, the Pennsylvania Republican Party in its challenge to the validity of votes mailed in on Election Day in 2020. But that's another story. Heather retired at age 50 in 2020 after arranging Mylan's merger with Upjohn, the first woman to head a Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company. Her accomplishments included Mylan's acquisition of Abbott Laboratories and a transfer of corporate headquarters to the Netherlands, bringing the merged company's tax rate down from 24% to 21%. The moral of the story is you don't really need an MBA to be a successful corporate executive. P.S. In March 2021, President Biden appointed Gail Connolly Manchin to co-chair the Appalachian Regional Commission, which disperses federal grants. $163,000 per year sinecure. Add that to Joe Biden's salary in the Senate, which I'm not mistaken is $180,000. That means a cool $343,000 income just from wages and salaries for the Manchin family. And of course, that doesn't count the extreme wealth that Heather Manchin fell into through the likely manipulations that her family was undertaking on her behalf to open the purse strings of the pharmaceutical industry to her. Anyway, Fred Gardner is the managing editor of O'Shaughnessy's. He can be reached at Fred at plebesite.com. And here's the final piece tonight. Yep. I think the Manchin family probably has more than its share of corruption in its midst. Don't you? Very likely, I think. Can't say for sure, but it certainly has the appearance of a conflict of interest. And there's Joe Manchin, that is. Paul Street had an article on June 9th, also from Counterpunch. Joe Manchin sucks. The Senate is absurd. And there's a little satirical sketch, I guess they call it a caricature, of Joe Manchin. Yes, U.S. Senator Joe Manchin, but Dem Republican of West Virginia, is a repugnant reptile who richly deserves your contempt. His vapid fascism enabling opposition to ending the Senate filibuster and to passing the We the People Act, H.R. 1, is despicable. I thought it was the For the People Act, but maybe the official title is the We the People Act. I have to double check that. The filibuster, which requires 60 of 100 Senate votes to hear and pass a bill, is an arch reactionary practice long used to block elementary civil rights, labor, and other reforms. As long as it holds, Congress is a big, sadistic game of right-wing, Simon says. You can forget about seeing the passage of serious and substantive liberal and progressive reforms. There goes that old-fashioned word, liberal. Few use it anymore. No matter how much support such reforms have from, well, we the people. The re-legalization of union organizing, as in the House passed Protect the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act, serious gun control measures to block the insane escalating epidemic of firearms violence and mass shootings, substantive police reform to end the continuing epidemic of racist police brutality. You can forget about all that and more as long as the neo-fascist white nationalist party of Trump, January 6th, and the big lie has the power to invoke the filibuster and say, quote, no, sorry, we no like. That's communism, unquote. The We the People Act would block racist and partisan gerrymandering, increase campaign finance transparency, and outlaw much of the current Jim Crow assault on minority rights underway in red state America, an assault that is driven by the big fascist lie claiming that the 2020 presidential election was stolen for Joe Biden. So say it with me. F Joe Manchin very much. Say it twice. Say it some more. And then get it out of your system. I say this for two reasons. First, the Manchin is a proxy, an excuse for other dreadful, dollar-drenched Senate Democrats and for a corporate Democratic president also named Joe. These senators and Biden get to seem to wholeheartedly embrace and advance liberal and progressive measures that the Democratic Party's base backs. The establishment Dems do so with the knowledge that the measures can't become law because of the filibuster kill switch, and because Manchin and his fellow Senator Kyrsten Sinema, Republican of Arizona, are in place to stop the Democrats from turning it off. But Manchin and Sinema make it possible for congressional and executive branch Citigroup Democrats to simultaneously tell liberal and progressive voters and pressure groups, quote, hey, we tried, unquote, and B, tell big business and conservative funders and lobbyists, quote, hey, that measure we backed, quote unquote, and that concerned you never really had a chance of passing. Don't sweat it. We had to cover our asses with our progressive voting base, unquote. That's the game, says Paul Street. Second, and speaking of systems, and Simon says, there's something much worse than even the horrific filibuster rule about the U.S. Senate. Something actually, unlike the filibuster, in the Constitution that nobody really wants to talk or even think about. I'm referring to the ridiculous, anti-democratic, overrepresentation of the nation's most Caucasian, rural, and reactionary regions in the extremely powerful upper body of, quote, our, unquote, their, unnecessarily, bicameral Congress, where Wyoming, home to less than 600,000 people, has as many representatives, two per state, as California, home to nearly 40 million people, more people than the population of 198 different sovereign nations. How bad is this violation of the elementary democratic principle of one person, one vote? It's surreal. Here is a list of how many U.S. senators the nation's 10 most populous states would have if they had the same population to senator ratio as Wyoming. California, bright blue, strongly Democratic, 136 senators. Texas, red, 102 senators. Florida, purple, 76 senators. New York, bright blue, 66 senators. Pennsylvania, purple, 44 senators. Illinois, bright blue, 43. Ohio, red, 40 senators. Georgia, purple, 37 senators. North Carolina, purple, 37 senators. Michigan, purple, 34 senators. Imagine if the nation's top 3 cities, all bright blue, were U.S. states enjoying the same U.S. population to U.S. senator ratio as Wyoming. New York City would have 30 U.S. senators. Los Angeles would have 14, and Chicago would have 9. Imagine the formula for New York City's boroughs. Brooklyn would have 9 senators. Queens would have 8. The Bronx would have 5. Manhattan would have 6. And little Trumpist, cop-filled Staten Island would be overrepresented with 2. I thought that part was great. That part with this 136 senators, I've never seen anyone do that one before. That was cool, folks. That was cool. Strange as this may sound in a nation that proclaims itself, quote, the world's greatest democracy, unquote. It is now possible, as Daniel Lazare has calculated and written, quote, to cobble together a Senate majority out of states that account for just 17.6% of the U.S. population, unquote. That is ridiculous, says Paul Street. Well, at least it is from a democratic perspective. Addressing this anti-democratic imbalance would require a constitutional amendment, but as Lazare, whose work on the nation's frozen republic constitution should be required civics reading in every American high school and college, has shown, such amendments are close to impossible on substantive matters under the U.S. Constitution's 5th article. If that sounds like authoritarian checkmate, and Simon says, that's because it is under the rules of their holy national charter, drafted and passed in the time of Louis XVI by and for slave owners, for slave owners and merchant capitalists and publicists for whom democracy was the ultimate nightmare and for whom liberty meant property, not popular sovereignty. If this sounds like a call for a new charter, that's because it is. We can't go on like this. We can't go on like this. But how the hell are we going to get a new charter? It's very unlikely we can get, almost impossible that we can get a new charter. The only way I see us getting a new charter that makes any sense at the current time, and I agree with Paul Street about this, the Senate itself is many times worse than the filibuster. And the filibuster only compounds the horribleness of the Senate. But even though we can't go on like this, the only way I can see a new charter coming to pass is if the various large states of the Union, relatively unrepresented as they are in the current Congress, come together. All the large states, certainly all the large, and democratic states, but come together and say, as a group, to the government of the United States, since we are unrepresented by this government, or not fairly represented by this government, because of the Senate, we are going to secede from the Union by a date certain. And that date will be, and let them negotiate a date. And then let them say to the people of the rest of the states, we don't really wish to leave the United States. We are patriotic Americans. But we could not accept any longer this system of terrible representation that exists in the Senate. So unless there is a new constitutional convention that eliminates the Senate, we are going to leave the Union and start our own country where we will be fairly represented in the legislature of that particular country. That's what is going to happen. I think that's the only way. Unless the United States is brought to the point of breaking up, there will be no incentive for the smaller states to actually negotiate fair representation with the larger states. Why should they? They have all the power now. Their senators have all the power now. Why should they create a fair system of representation for the nation at large? I mean, if I lived in Montana, or if I lived in, say, Wyoming, I might want to have 2 senators for my state, and I might want to have my own vote for the Senate count 136 times more than the vote of someone who lives in California. Why not? Anyway, until the country is brought into that kind of crisis, I don't see this changing. I really don't. You'll have to admit, I think, that the history of this country over the last 40 years or so, and of course before then too, but especially in the last 40 years, has never been anything close to fairness and light, in our politics. So that's it. I will now consider your comments. And Lana says, howdy, and I guess I went over Steve Gonzo's comment. Carmen Muniz says, great background. Yes, that's my scholarly background. And Kay says, thank you, Dolores. I got no notice. I guess I went over that. I really got to see my notices have all been screwed up. Ghost Start says, shared. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi. Hiya, Steve. Terry Cook says, 1 acre of hemp growing produces 2 year-round green jobs. 50 million acres brings 50 million never to leave jobs with a $25 an hour starting minimum wage. The Top Cat plan, go to the categories. More important, Terry, how much CO2 is sequestered in the ground by 1 acre of hemp? That's what we want to know. How much is sequestered in the ground? Kay says shared. I guess I can look that up myself if worse comes to worse, right? Carmen says gerrymandering is what's giving us Republican governors plus entitled boomers and clueless ex-hippies. Terry Cook says, the clueless hippies are going green independent Congress 2022. Go JNN.com, ccrg.info. Terry shows up every once in a while to give us all these links. I don't really mind. It's not, you do that. It's all right with me. See that baby crying? Oops. See that baby crying? She doesn't want the jab. Kay says, Summers needs to go home and stay there. Well, he can make calls from home, unfortunately. He needs to go home and eat ice cream and leave the rest of us alone. That's what he needs to do. Karen Muniz says, tsk, tsk, go away, troll spray. Tsk, tsk. Terry Cook says, never in our nation's history has so much been taken from the productive class to go to the non-productive class of greedy guts. The TopCatPlan.com Citizens Committee for a Restructured Government, ccrg.info. It will take $44 trillion to go total green, but we will no longer be spending $117 trillion for our energy. Over what period of years is that, Terry? Is that a 10-year figure? Is that a 10-year figure? If so, I think it's an underestimate, because you're saying only $4.4 trillion a year to go total green. I think it's got to be more than that. Anyway, Evelina says, Russian says it plans to leave the dollar and move to the euro. If Russia says it, well, first of all, Russia is not now part of any dollar zone. Okay, so I'm not sure what they mean that they plan to leave the dollar and move to the euro. But if they mean to go into the eurozone, they're going to cripple their currency. They won't be a monetary sovereign anymore. So I don't think they really need that. I don't think they really mean that. Terry Cook says, we have godlike powers right now. 6 years ago, we did not. Harnessing the power of the wind and ocean while producing green hydrogen, plus the being currently in the energetic matrix, Jill Stein's Broad Awakening, Agnostic, open source for all. And even when it says Russia, and Kay says, yes, oh bummer, era 2. Even when it says, with so many sanctions placed on so many countries, more will follow. Kay says, that's what Professor Wolf said too. Inflation is no worry. Yes, I noticed he did say that. Steve Gonzo said Trump administration spied on Democrats in Congress and even their children. Yeah, they spied on journalists and their children too. Terry Cook says propeller windmills suck. Enclosed vertical wind turbines produce tens of times more power. Yes, vertical wind turbines are much better and they're safer too. They're built to last 500 years, lubricated by hemp oil, built with hemp composite. The Top Cat Plan. Go ava.us, go jnn.com, ccrg.info. Steve Wolfbrand says, I think the pandemic caused a lot of people to rethink their lives. Was that shitty, low-paying job with very rude customers really worth it? And many people are searching for a new direction. They know the word inflation scares the average Joe. They do. Joe has the greedy gut elite pegged. Fear brings us down. Love, passion, and hope brings us out of a modern-day dark age. Marsha Blackburn, Roy Blunt, John Cornyn, Tom Cotton, Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema. What a motley crew. This is just the start of a list of senators who are both backed by millions in Coca network money and publicly oppose the For the People Act. Yeah, Marsha Blackburn is really, as far as I'm concerned, she is scum, really. She's really disgusting person. Sorry, I scrolled down too fast. Here we go. I stopped at Steve Gonzo. Marsha Blackburn. Even it says, obscene. Why are these people in government at all? They should be banned, not what the people need. Look, if people vote for incumbents and will not vote for third parties, even when they can, that's what you get. If they insist on voting for incumbents, You're going to have people like Marsha Blackburn elected and reelected all the time. That's just the way things are going to be. Carmen Muniz says, I think I read that Biden is out to prosecute the author that wrote about how little taxes the rich pay. I believe the article was in BuzzFeed, but I'm not sure. It was in ProPublica. I sincerely doubt that Biden is going to prosecute the author. There were two authors, by the way, of the report from ProPublica. Terry Cook, if is the biggest word, but enlightenment has the most synonyms. Insight, understanding, awareness, education, learning, knowledge, illumination, awakening, infrastructure. Okay, I will skip the rest of this. I heard today that Obama never replaced Bush's head of SSA-2. He was way worse than I thought. Corporate ass. And Biden has not yet replaced Rubs either, says Kay. And Carmen says, Joe Manchin, the Manchurian, has Stockholm for the stocks. Kay says, I heard a good interview with Reverend Barber last evening. Yeah, Reverend Barber is usually very eloquent. Terry says, expat gal on exposing the agenda between COVID-19 vaccinations. Hi, Mark. Dr. Simone Gold referenced this fact. Every person that takes the vaccine, she is being automatically enrolled in a tracking and tracing pharmacovigilance tracking system on the medical trial. For 2 years that was being run by the Department of Defense is now being run by Oracle. Why is it now being run by Oracle? I posted the article with America's Frontline Doctors' Recommendation, COVID vaccine order, hydrochloroquine. I haven't seen Joe's articles change since the week. There was a good Our Revolution town hall earlier from West Virginia on Manchin's downfalls on jobs. Unfortunately, Manchin has never had so much power. Shake my head. I don't think Facebook likes progressive live streams. I'm sure it doesn't. Terry Cook, stop trying to distract because you want attention. We're not falling for it. West Virginia is closing a pharma company, which is why Our Revolution had a town hall there today. And Carmen said, isn't Heather copying Shkreli? Well, she's not anymore. She may have been at the time, but she's not anymore because she's no longer the CEO. Carmen says, holy shiitake, Heather is hemlock. Carmen Muniz says, good piece by Fred. Steve Gonzo says, Ron Johnson says, President Biden is a liberal, progressive, socialist, Marxist. Aren't these guys funny? I mean, these guys are really ridiculous. Could anybody be stupider than someone who's calling Joe Biden a liberal, progressive, socialist, Marxist? Terry Cook says the subject was creating jobs. What do you have on that subject? Terry says, I care about saving lives, not getting attention. Carmen says, why isn't this troll begone spray not working? Must be an okra. Jeffrey Denton says, Steve Gonzo, who's attacked Social Security like all Republicans at least 3 times. Jeffrey Denton says, I don't understand how these people could think there are 2 different military-industrial complexes, 2 different fossil fuel industries, 2 different medical industrial complexes, and 2 different pharmaceutical industries that own each party. Because there ain't. There's only one of each, and each one owns both parties, and each one is owned by the same pirate banking globalist cartel. Carmen Muniz says, well, go to a hospital then. Divorce the Senate, suck, and form your own sovereign currency. I like it. Kay says, good plan by blue states. Can we move there from other states? Well, if there were a secession movement of some kind, okay, then undoubtedly the terms of any separation would be, if it were a peaceful separation, that people who wanted to could move to the states that they wanted, okay, to live in. Hopefully, the two groups of states would find a way to fund those moves so there really would be freedom to move. Kay says, I want out of Ohio so bad, laugh out loud. Evelina says, yes, sir, right you are. Carmen says, scientists want to remove CO2 from the oceans and turn it into limestone. Fine by me. Yeah, some of them who have that kind of process, okay, in mind, but we can also sequester it, okay, in the soil using the right plants. Evelina says, for international trade, they're moving to the euro. They plan to join the eurozone after the economic disaster experienced by the eurozone because the nations do not have currency sovereignty. Oh, that would be folly. 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 Of course, Putin is a neoliberal, so maybe he will. I mean, he's a neoliberal, so why not? I mean, neoliberals love the eurozone. They're doing so well there. Okay, folks, looks like that's it. I hope you liked tonight. I enjoyed doing it. Uh, I will be off tomorrow, and I will be back on Saturday. And I've been working on a surprise, which will come around probably by July. Uh, Stay tuned for that one. It's going to be extremely interesting, I think. I don't know why I've been moving more and more over to this side of the screen. Let me see if I can find out why that's happening. Okay. Maybe I just got to move my camera over a little bit. That seems to work better. And Dolores says thank you and good night. And Steve says good night, you guys. Steve Wolfbrandt, that is. And Lana Dell says good night. Good night to you, Lana. And Kay says thank you all for a great discussion. I love you all. And we love you, Kay. And Evelina says, night, everyone. Carmen Mina says, sweet, great live stream as always. Thanks, bunches. Good night, John Boy. John Boy, eh? Haven't heard that in some time. Okay. Thanks a lot for coming. I'll see you Saturday. Steve says, sweet dreams, and don't let those bed bugs bite. Same to you, Steve. Take care. Thanks for coming.